This is a really interesting post, which raises a misconception that I want to talk about, despite the fact that I do not want to start talking about the Confederacy again. But I'm going to. Okay. So there's this idea that most of the Confederate statues that are around today were put in place during the Civil Rights era. And it's very reasonable to make that assumption, right? There was actually a spike in the amount of Confederate memorials that were put up during the civil rights movement, but the majority of them were not placed during the civil rights era. So if you look at this timeline of when Confederate monuments and Confederate symbols were being placed in the United States, you're actually going to see that the majority of them, the very largest peak in their creation, falls between about 1900 and 1920. And this is very important for a very specific reason. The first reason why it starts off at around 1900 with this large peak in the number of Confederate monuments is because it is now, 40-ish years past the end of the Civil War, and the veterans are now dying. So the Daughters of the Confederacy form themselves as a group to sort of, rally around the Confederate veterans of the Civil War. The Daughters of the Confederacy not only push for the building of these monuments between 1900 and 1920, they also begin to severely whitewash the textbooks during that time period in the South. And that is why it's important that it happens between 1900 and 1920, not during the Civil Rights era. Because if you look at the age of some of the people who were violently opposed to civil rights during the Civil Rights era, as an example, let's look at my least favorite human being of this period, which is Strom Thurmond. He was born in 1902, which means that he basically grew up in a world where he only consumed textbooks, history textbooks, that had been okayed by the Daughters of the Confederacy, since he was from South Carolina. A few years after Thurmond was born, the UDC, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, held their annual convention in Charleston, South Carolina, during which the president of the organization said that it has ever been the cherished purpose of the Daughters of the Confederacy to secure greater educational opportunities for Confederate children, and by thorough training of their powers of mind, heart, and hand, render it possible for the representatives of our Southern race to retain for that race its supremacy in its own land. This is exactly what Moms for Liberty is doing today. They are shaping the minds of the future generation, just like the UDC shaped the minds of Southerners who would be opposed to integration in the 1950s and the Civil Rights era. This is how they get you. May not be able to change our minds right now, but they can change the minds of the kids through education.